Hey everyone, thanks for watching Private Online. My name's Derek Silva. I'm the global community lead here at Orchid, and it's great to be back again for the second time this year. For anybody who's not aware, we did this once already in March. We had Edward Snowden, we had a bunch of great thinkers and some practitioners as well, thinking about privacy, digital security, what that means, how we practice it, and what's happening going forward. And it went so well, we decided to do it again with the same team in the background helping us manage it. We've got seven. We've got a partnership with Handshake, appropriate, today as well, and it's just really exciting to be here again. Speaking of Handshake, Chjango Unchained from the DWeb Foundation and representing Handshake as well. Thanks for joining up with us and helping us put on this event once again this year.
Yeah, it was a amazing fortuitous event for us to join up with Private Online. You guys had Edward Snowden come on last time, and this time we have Glenn Greenwald here, kind of closing the loop on that end. So yeah, yeah, thank you so much for working together. It's been great. I'm Chjango, and I'm a longtime cryptocurrency advocate. I've been in Bitcoin since 2014, and I've been being an evangelist for nation projects ever since then. Back then, it was Bitcoin, and today it's a decentralized domain name project called Handshake.
That's great. And I know we're going to hear a lot more about Handshake later today. We have an amazing slew of guests. I just want to give a little bit of context here. We have people like Glenn Greenwald, as you mentioned. We have Naomi Brockwell, who is very well known in the space. I don't want to downplay all of her other contributions, but she certainly made a name for herself by making some amazing content, music specifically.
Just you can that
And
now.
We also have Willy Woo. We've got Isaiah Jackson, Ayla, Lee Quen, Josh Goldbard. It's going to be an amazing day, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody speak, and I'm sure learning a lot. How about you, Chjango? What are you looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to talking about the sorts of solutions that are out there that circumvent online censorship, deplatforming, demonetization, and all those nefarious things that lead us sort of into this trajectory where we're going to have something like a social credit system and all these dystopian nightmares coming to life. So blockchain is sort of one of the solutions to leading us to that utopia, I guess. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today, and that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, I think that's one of the differences you'll see from the first edition of Private Online or Private Virtual Summit back in March to today. I feel like we have a lot more practitioners. We have a lot more people who are actually in the space, doing the things, making mobile to mobile payments possible using a very secure platform. Crypto powered VPN where we know nothing about you, decentralized domain name service, etc. So I hope that everybody really, leans in and hears what's being said and really engages with the projects, the communities, buys their own handshake domains and stuff like that. Speaking of which, I think we should touch a little bit on, we actually have some handshake top level domains up for auction today. Can you talk a little bit about that? We don't want to preempt too much because that's obviously going to happen, but I think we should give everybody watching and listening just a hint of what's coming up later today at the end of the show.
Yeah, the main event is going to be followed up by a live auction, and that auction is going to have really rare top level domains. So, for those of you who don't know, a top level domain is com, for example, whatever comes after the dot, so .com, that's a top level domain. In Handshake, what happened is they've basically democratized this whole namespace to one in such a way that you could make up almost anything. So, Derek, you could say, okay, I want .silva, and then you could do some personal branding. If Glenn wanted it, he could have .greenwald, and then he could have the sublevel domain glenn.greenwald, and then basically do some personal branding off of that. And so what we have in the online auction later this evening is we have some very rare ones. What tends to happen in the domain space is single letter top level domains tend to be extremely valuable. And we have one such one that's going to be up for auction. It's .x. And there's another one. There's multiple ones. There's single letter, single character emojis, and those are going for some pipe and hot rates right now. There's some alternative projects that are selling single character top level domains for, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's kind of at the lower end. And so we're going to be seeing some really hot bids going on, and I'm very excited for that. And this is going to be a great event.
That's terrific. And some of the proceeds are going to charities, correct?
Yeah. So Handshake actually raised $10 million in private sale, and they donated 100% of that to open source organizations like EFF, like Tor, the the Onion Routing Network, and many other organizations in the open source space. And now there are a couple of entities that are completely community run. One of them being DWeb Foundation. There's another one called Handshake Institute, and there's another one called HNS Fund. And all of those drive community adoption of Handshake, and basically drive adoption of more of the Web3 space, or what I like to call decentralized web. And so these are really important for bringing these sort of decentralized tools to the fore. And we do important nonprofit work and give grants to doing core development work and all of this other maintenance work, and browser integrations, for example. That's a big one.
Awesome. That's great. I'm really glad to hear that. So first of all, somebody go hit up to Elon, because I'm sure he's going to want .x.
Yeah.
And also go hit up the Yat Maxis, hit up Fluffy Pony, hit up people who have bought single emoji Yats, because that's a natural fit. They really should want these single emoji handshake TLDs as well. I'm going to leave that somebody else to go do that on Twitter. I'm busy already, but that's terrific. I'm looking forward to seeing the auction happening in a Telegram group later today, right? And and seeing what happens and what comes out of that. So that's good. I think that now is a good time to kick it over to the next session. Chjango, can you take over here and introduce our first set of guests, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So upcoming very shortly is our keynote speaker, Glenn Greenwald. I have been a fan and a follower of his Substack for a long time now, and he's a traditional liberal in the 1990s sense of the word, and he started. He broke out into notoriety at The Guardian when he broke the Edward Snowden case, and he kind of started The Intercept ever since then. And The Intercept was meant to be this check in the powers that be, as what journalism is intended to be originally. And very recently, ever since he tried to publish the Joe Biden news, or he tried to publish something very critical of Joe Biden, and then his own outlet tried to censor him. And that was when he broke out and resigned in a big way and went onto Substack, becoming the #1 Substack publisher there. And so very excited to have Glenn Greenwald on. We're also going to have Naomi Brockwell, which Derek, you're going to give a better intro than I can for that.
Yeah, Naomi is fantastic. These days, she spends a lot of her time over on CoinDesk, but she also has an amazing resume, which I've got here. There we go. Sorry.
I've also listened to Naomi's songs. I think she plays guitar.
Yes, she does. And she's a great singer. And like I said, I wasn't trying to downplay everything else she's doing, because she's also a tech journalist, film and TV producer. She's the creator of NBTV. That's a channel focused on privacy, tech, and crypto. She literally just posted a video the other day talking about Bitcoin mining and how you don't need KYC to do that. She has over 95,000 subscribers on YouTube. One of the largest channels on Odyssey, which you may also know as library.tv. LBRY. That's an alternative platform to YouTube that's based on blockchain tech, with over 30 million unique monthly visitors. Since 2015, Naomi has been a producer for 19 Emmy Award winning journalist John Stossel. She hosts CoinDesk TV daily show called The Hash. She's a regular on network television discussing cryptocurrency, privacy, and alternative social media, doing the good Lord's work. She is also producer for the 2015 documentary Bitcoin, The End of Money as We Know It, which was a winner of Best International Documentary at the Anthem Film Festival. winner of the Special Jury Prize at the Amsterdam Film Festival. And she's also the producer of the 2018 award-winning documentary about the housing crash called The Bubble. From 2013 to 2015, she worked as a policy associate at the New York Bitcoin Center. She's the co-founder of the Soho Forum, which is a popular New York debate series, and sits on the advisory council of the Mancal Economic Education Foundation. I bet you didn't know half of this stuff, which is amazing, just the amount of work she's able to put in. She's built large communities across over a dozen decentralized and alternative social media and content platforms, and absolutely deserves your respect. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Greenwald and Naomi Brockwell and Stephen Waterhouse.
Hey, everybody.
So we're going to pass it off to Seven, Glenn, and Naomi.
Hi, Glenn. Hi, Naomi. How are you doing? Glenn, you're on mute. Everybody unmute your microphones for 1 second.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. Hi, Glenn. How are you? Hi, Naomi. Welcome to Priv8 version 2. It's very exciting to be here with you both. And also exciting for all the people who will be joining us for Priv8. I didn't get an intro earlier, but I was co-founder and CEO of Orchid. We're hosting the conference along with Handshake. Very excited to be here with all of you. I'm going to kick off the first session, Glenn, just you and I having a little bit of a chat before you launch into giving us a bit of insight from your side on your own. I think it's very poetic. I like poetic things in life. I think it's very poetic that we had Snowden on in the first one, which I was very excited. It was probably the most nerve-wracking interview I've ever done, and I've done a few speaking engagements. But ever since that, I've actually been very comfortable on stage and in all sorts of situations. I think maybe he broke something in me, but it's equally exciting and also nerve-wracking to interview you. Because it was really yours and also Laura's work to actually break the story in a very dramatic way. And there's been not only the fictional encounter, but also the fictional version, but also the actual documentary version of that moment in Hong Kong and all the things that followed on from that. So I'm not going to, I think, perhaps dig into all those things, even though that would be super exciting. I'm really interested in, first of all, first couple of questions is your relationship with free speech, and also I noticed that I wouldn't say we like have exactly the same political alignments, but certainly it's difficult to paint me into the standard kind of political thinking process, and I think that is somewhat emblematic of people who really are pushing for free speech in a broad way and its effect on democracy. So I guess to sort of, how do you think about free speech today, and especially on the internet?
Yeah, so I look, if you look back at my career, it is, I think you could call it an unconventional career in the sense that I currently work as a journalist. That's obviously been the primary focus of my work over the last 15 years, and yet I by no means had most or even really any of the standard components to how one becomes a journalist. I didn't go to Columbia Journalism School. I never worked at the New York Times. I didn't begin in that storied way of, covering local school boards for a local newspaper or anything like that. In fact, when I, started writing about politics in 2005, it was because I essentially had decided that there were issues, really critical issues, primarily in the realm of civil liberties, that deserved a lot more attention than they were getting. And at the time, there was a technology that was actually pretty new called blogging software, where you could, without any institutional support, simply go to Google's Blogspot or other programs and click create blog, and suddenly you had a platform where you were able to communicate with other people. And that's essentially how I began my journalism career, and my audience grew from there. But prior to that, I had spent the last, say, 12 years or so working as a constitutional lawyer in New York. And of course, over that time, the political landscape has shifted greatly. In that time, we went from kind of the low stakes politics of, Bill Clinton and the decade of the 90s, where the Soviet Union had fallen. There was finally no more Cold War. We were supposed to have this peace dividend. I think the dominance in that decade by things like relatively unimportant sex scandals and the like indicates that politics was kind of low stakes. And then it was followed by the 9/11 attack, which was exactly the opposite. Everything became very high stakes. And that's what motivated me to go write about politics. And this whole time, despite all this kind of, turbulence, both in the political landscape and in my own work, there are a few constants that I can identify, one of which is my devotion as a foundational principle to free speech. And I've thought about why that was. And I think a lot of it has to do, and typically our politics often has to do with the era in which our political sensibilities were formed. So I was born in 1967, so I kind of started becoming of age and conscious of politics in, say, the late 70s, early 80s, formed very much by things like the Watergate scandal and the spying abuses on the part of the FBI uncovered by the Church Committee, but also a lot of the wars over free speech that happened, for example, in 1977, when the ACLU, predominantly Jewish leftist lawyers of the ACLU, decided to defend actual Nazis, people who dress up in Nazi uniforms and wear swastika armbands, who wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, a town of overwhelmingly Jewish Holocaust survivors. And those kinds of debates were of a civil liberties variety. How much protection do we need from tyrannical abuse of state power? And my views of it were formed based on what had been the predominant revelations at the time, is that if you give the state too much unchecked authority, they're going to abuse it. And free speech, for me, became a foundational view, both because the one thing you don't want to empower institutions to decide is which ideas aren't permissible to be aired, but also because free speech seemed to me to be the primary tool to combat the excesses of tyrannical power. And that has been a through line. As a lawyer, I worked on a lot of free speech cases, including controversial ones. It tends to be people who have very unpopular views who are targeted with censorship. So if you want to defend free speech, you end up defending on people with unpopular views. And then as a journalist in the war on terror, free speech began threatened, and I worked a lot on that. And now there's a threat coming from pressures on big tech companies to censor. So there's kind of a through line, at least in my work, around this issue.
Yeah, that's great. I have a lot of alignment with your thinking process. And I was born just a couple of years later than you, but in a different part of the world. But also, as I grew up during in my early career on the internet, thinking about how internet censorship was initially being pushed forwards and the fights that we had on that. The same thing, I've been working in the Bitcoin and crypto space since 2013, and really the first concept that really aligned me with that was this idea of censorship-resistant money. At the time I was like, can we create a monetary system that doesn't require, and most people often think about this as like, oh, what does that really mean? We can move money between bad people, or it's all about kind of like, the sketchier parts of the internet. But to me, it's like expressing yourself through your investments, or expressing yourself through how you transfer money to a part of the world where someone needs money, you're kind of donating and so on. That's also an expression of free speech. And with our work with Orchid, we actually focus specifically on the idea of building censorship-resistant systems. As you've looked at or become aware of the space that we spend a lot of our time in the crypto space, have you become aware of, I think you kind of had a quote recently talking about the kind of alignment of deep state and Silicon Valley powers and other corporations with governments sort of like coming for different parts of free speech and so on. There's definitely a sense within the crypto community that that's happening to us too. We feel like, oh, hang on a second, all of a sudden, the new guys in charge, and it's not that different from what just happened before. So we're definitely feeling a lot of pressure in that. Do you have any thoughts on that, or how you think that the sort of kind of institutions are opposed to things and aligning themselves more with, say, the banking system that exists or the other powers that are already installed?
Yeah, I think the historical context here is critical, which demonstrates not just over the past several decades, but centuries and even millennia, that if there's a technology that's invented that can vest power in new factions and can alter the disbursement of power and the status quo authority, there's going to be an effort on the part of prevailing power centers to commandeer that technology, because they don't want new technologies that can subvert the prevailing order. That's what the ruling class by definition does, is try and preserve its status. And I think we've seen that even though these themes are often buried, these same themes asserting themselves in what appear to be discrete controversies, but which actually are part of the same kind of ongoing arms race, if you will, over who gets to control this information. So when we did the Snowden story, it's often remembered as a story about invasion of privacy on the part of the NSA and the United States for principles, spying allies in the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And of course, it is a story about that, but it's a story about a lot of other things. For me, one of the most important of which, maybe the most important, is that union of Silicon Valley, the deep state, or the security state services, whatever you want to call them. The second story that we did was about the PRISM program, in which the 9 largest tech companies were in secret cooperating extensively with the US government by turning over vast troves of data about their customers with no court order, without anybody actually knowing about it. And it was then when I began to see this kind of union that had clearly emerged. And I think when we get into, say, the Trump years, and there was a concern on the part of a lot of power centers, leaving politics aside, about the disruptive nature that the Trump campaign and then the Trump presidency would usher in. The one thing the ruling class likes is stability, not instability. And he was certainly a disruptive force. That union of kind of the security services working together with Silicon Valley, then with Wall Street, then with the corporate media, to subvert that disruption and to preserve status quo stability became even more visible to me. And, I've been working a lot more on and focusing a lot more on crypto and blockchain and Bitcoin and the like. In terms of the political and philosophical underpinnings of it, I think one of the things that happened, and you alluded to this just now, was when it was first introduced, when the people started first hearing about Bitcoin, it kind of got depicted as this sort of libertarian currency, this ability for people to make investments without being tracked by the state. And it got attached to this kind of right-wing libertarian ideology, which made many other sectors of the ideological spectrum inherently hostile to it, especially the left. And one of the things I've been trying to do over the past couple of years, especially as I think more about crypto and Bitcoin and how it relates to these broader political debates, is how to persuade people that no matter your political ideology, this centralized control, this ability to track what we're doing, to police our discourse, to control what it is we're saying and doing by virtue of this surveillance, is a threat to all forms of political organizing and the ability to decentralize and to render much more difficult to surveil not just our financial activities, but our online activities, our political activities, all things that increasingly Bitcoin and now crypto and blockchain enable, is something that is in the interest of essentially everybody, regardless of ideology. To me, that's one of the challenges, is how to reframe and recommunicate what that movement is about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think as we move into a potential era of programmable money and central bank, or as Ed calls them, central fascist currency, things he called them recently. I think it's even more important that people become aware of these concepts of decentralization and how important they are to our privacy. Glenn, I believe you have some solo stuff you wanted to go through now, and so I'll hand over to you to present. And it's great catching up with you.
Yeah. Thanks for those great questions. I think it's the perfect segue actually into just a couple of the points that I wanted to touch on. I think we talked about my having 15 minutes or so. So if somebody wants to kind of alert me as we're getting close, that'd be great. Or I can even kind of keep track myself here. What I wanted to do was actually talk about what I view as kind of the history of these privacy debates over the internet. Because one of the things that I think internet culture has done is accelerate the perception of time, so that years like 1995 and 1996, which in reality are part of our generation, seem almost lifetimes ago. And one of the things that I really love to do is to go back to those mid-90s discussions of what the internet was going to mean. You can obviously find some hilariously wrong proclamations. Paul Krugman famously dismissed the importance of the internet as something that was going to have similar effects as like the fax machine, and would quickly go the way of the fax machine. And lots of people in media, for self-interested reasons, were mocking the idea that the internet was ever going to be a significant technology. But the predominant theme, I think, at the time was this triumphalism, the idea that the internet was one of the most important human innovations in centuries because of its liberatory power, its power to emancipate, to democratize, to liberalize how human beings interacted with one another. And in particular, it would enable people to engage in activity that once required enormous corporations with vast resources. I alluded to earlier how in 2005, I was able to create a blog and start to reach first thousands of people, and then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and even more, simply by just clicking a button that said create blog. And, even 5 or 10 years earlier, that would have been impossible. You needed the vast resources in order to have a newspaper, you needed a printing press and the infrastructure necessary to produce that and to distribute it. Obviously, television was even more difficult. You needed cameras and satellites and networks. And so the internet really did enable what used to be the province of very large institutions and the rich people who controlled them to become vested in the hands of average citizens. And that was the revolutionary component of the internet. And you go back and read the kind of optimistic views of what the internet was going to usher in. And it was very much based on this idea that it was the first technology in probably since, the Enlightenment that was really going to liberate us, emancipate us from, as human beings, as individuals, from centralized corporate and state control. And I remember very well when I first started using it, that's what excited me so much about it. And I continue 25 years later to believe that the central battle of our time, the central political battle of our time and technological battle of our time is whether that vision of the internet is going to be fulfilled or whether it will be subverted. As I said earlier, history is filled with examples of not just new technologies, but even new ideas emerging that seem like they're intended to pose a threat to prevailing power centers and are created for that reason. And yet those prevailing power centers think about ways either first to destroy it and crush it, and if they can't, how to co-opt and commandeer it. You see this, just to give you a kind of banal but still vivid example, there's over the last 10 or 15 years, people have created this kind of social justice ideology that's intended to be liberatory about race and gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity that was designed to say we're going to challenge the status quo that has been dominated by a white male patriarchy or a white male heteronormative patriarchy. And this ideology that exists that says we're going to kind of emphasize the marginalized groups who have rarely been in control. It was intended to be a ideology that challenged power, but what it ended up becoming was something that has been co-opted. So now you see, the GCHQ, which is the British equivalent of the NSA, one of the most aggressive spying agencies in the world, bathing itself each year in the colors of the rainbow flag to celebrate LGBT diversity, or the CIA promoting videos of its agents talking about how I'm a Latina woman and I have anxiety disorder, and just kind of co-opting the language, but saying, but I found a home at the CIA. So this is always the battle, is when there's a oppositional force to some hegemonic power, they try to either destroy it or co-opt it. And I think that's what the battle of the internet has become. When I first went to Hong Kong to meet Edward Snowden for the first time in May of 2013, or the very beginning of June of 2013, I had been talking to Snowden as my source for several months, but I had no idea anything about him. I didn't know where he worked. I didn't know what his name was. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know his age. I knew nothing about him. He claimed he had this huge archive of very sensitive top secret documents about the most secretive agency within the world's most powerful government. And he wanted me to come to Hong Kong to meet him. And I told him, before I do, you need to send me at least a few documents to prove that you're real before I fly across the world. And he sent me 20 documents that were, incredibly shocking, including the prison program I described earlier, which was enough to convince me to go meet him. And I got on a plane, I think the next day, flew to New York from Brazil, met with my editors of The Guardian. That night, flew with Laura Poitras from New York to Hong Kong, met Edward Snowden. And I was shocked when the person who appeared before me was not this 65-year-old grizzled veteran of the National Security Agency, but as you've seen, at the time he was 29, he looked younger, almost like a kind of mall rat, like a 23-year-old kid who looked like he worked in a video game store. And so when I realized that he was who he was, namely someone who really did have hundreds of thousands, if not more, of extremely sensitive top secret documents from this secretive agency, it was going to become one of the most important sources in the world, but also was likely to end up in prison for the rest of his life. I really needed to understand, before I used his documents and put him in that position, that A, he knew the risks he was taking, but B, that both he and I understood why he was motivated to do that. And he's not very introspective, at least he wasn't at the time. He doesn't like to talk about himself. He likes to talk about the revelations, but I needed to understand why someone in his position, with a very stable and prosperous life, someone who wasn't alienated or rejected by society, but quite the contrary, had a very comfortable place in society, was willing to go to prison for the next several decades, if not the rest of their lives, in pursuit of this cause. And what he finally convinced me of as his motive was, he described how when he was growing up as this kid in this lower middle class family, his father had no money or position or prestige. He was in the Coast Guard for 30 years, that the internet was the most important technology in his life. It was the thing that, he couldn't travel to Europe. He couldn't travel to Latin America or Africa. The internet was what enabled him to be able to explore the world, and not just explore the world, but also explore himself. That the anonymity that the internet provided at the time, there were no IP addresses, there were no ability to track who was doing what. So that anonymity gave you this cover to kind of explore yourself, to engage in dissent and creativity and exploration and experimentation about who you were and what you thought and what you wanted to be, without fear that it would reflect on you forever, or would stick to you, or would be used to track you. And so he told me, when he realized that the internet had been degraded from what he thought it was, which is this place of unparalleled human freedom into what it was becoming, which was this unprecedented tool of coercion and control, he convinced me that he regarded that technology of the internet, a free internet, a decentralized and anonymous internet, as being of such enormous value, both to himself and his own life, but also to society as a whole, that he believed it was worth sacrificing for and fighting for. And that was certainly my own experience of the internet, of how I used the internet when I was 23 and 24 and 25 and first began on CompuServe and AOL and then the broader internet, experimenting and exploring. And although 1996 and even 2013 does seem like several lifetimes ago, when we have a fast-moving politics and internet discourse and Trump and all the things that has brought, and Brexit and the tumult throughout the democratic world and the Western world, to me, there is this constant theme to most of our political debates that is still very much grounded in that original conflict, that original battle that he convinced me he was motivated by, and that I ultimately became motivated by, well, which is whether we are going to have the internet as a free means of communicating. And it's not, what I came to realize, it's not, the battle is not just about if we allow the internet to become subject to centralized coercion and control and monitoring. It doesn't mean it doesn't just mean that we've lost something incredibly valuable, a free internet. It does mean that, but it means something much more pernicious. It means that the internet then becomes not an unparalleled tool of liberation and democratization, but an unparalleled tool of coercion and control. And I think that is what it has become. There has never been a technology that has enabled any government, no matter how repressive, to track citizens and to collect data about people, not just what we do, but how we think, more powerfully than the internet is now vesting states and other corporate power centers to assemble. I remember one of the most striking things that happened was, as you might recall, one of the big stories that happened during the Snowden reporting was it was revealed that the United States government under President Obama was spying not just on world leaders who were our adversaries, as you would expect, China and Iran and Russia, but also our allies. Here in Brazil, it became a huge scandal that the United States was spying on the then Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff, a democratically elected center-left president who was an ally of the United States. But the biggest one was they were spying on the cell phone of German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And in October of 2013, when she learned of that, she called President Obama and said, she was indignant by all accounts, and said, this is the kind of stuff the Stasi did. And it had a lot of meaning coming from her because she grew up in East Germany, and Stasi dominated East Germany. And The Guardian went at the time and interviewed Stasi officials, Stasi agents, about that claim. And the Stasi said, actually, the capabilities that we're learning about that have been developed are so far beyond what we ever dreamed we would be capable of doing. We relied on citizen reports. We could maybe spy on 25% of what our targets were doing. There were huge gaps in our ability to understand what people were doing and thinking and saying. And so to have a system like this would be a dream beyond our wildest dreams. And so as we start to see increasing levels of censorship over our political speech, not just surveillance, but increasing attempts to train the citizenry to know what lines they have to stay within in terms of what we are allowed to say or not allowed to say if we want to be heard on the biggest platforms, an incredibly authoritarian mentality and climate that has arisen, along with the ability to monitor everything we're doing. I've increasingly come to believe that, at least for me, the greatest cause is finding a way out of that censorship and that control, not just to get back to a free internet, but to liberate ourselves from this incredible amount of repression. Things like creating alternatives to big tech and free speech platforms is one way, but it has been the reason why, despite still being somewhat challenged on the technological components of how Bitcoin and crypto and blockchain work, I couldn't give you an exposition on the sort of technological and mathematical components of it as well as others could. It's certainly been something that I've become almost daily more and more excited about as an actual means of returning us to a decentralized form of communication. I think it touches on every aspect of our politics and our culture, and ultimately, more subtly but more insidiously, what it even means to be a free human being. How much of our thoughts are actually our own instead of ones that are being directed and manufactured from the outside. So that's sort of the broad historical perspective through which I understand all of these issues, and the kind of personal journey that I've traversed in order to come to see things the way that I do, and why my priorities are what they are.
Thanks, Glenn. I think you definitely answered a number of the questions I'd had earlier, and also went way beyond that. I hope that the community that I'm a big part of in this crypto community can make a difference. Is already hopefully making a difference in this space. But I know that it's going to be also down to people like yourself actually exposing what's happening and constantly pushing and questioning things. So I just want to say thank you and appreciate all that you do. I'm going to hand over now to, I think, Derek.
Hey, thanks, Evan. I already gave an extensive background on Naomi Brockwell, so I'm not going to belabor the point. She is a content creator. She's embraced cryptocurrency and blockchain immensely. It's literally part of her day job, and I think this would be a great opportunity to pass things over to her. And yeah, as somebody who's really in the space and using the very tools that Seven and Glenn were just speaking about.
Well, thank you so much,
Naomi,
Derek.
over to you.
Yeah, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And Glenn, it's such an honor to chat with you. You're a huge inspiration for me. I mean, the risks that you take as a journalist are inspiring, but I think that your integrity is something that I think all journalists need to be aspiring towards.
Thank you.
So it's just really, it's really a big, it's a huge moment to be able to chat with you. So I do want to dive into two things when I talk with you today. The first thing, I want to dive into this idea of the fourth estate. You have very eloquently explained what that is in your book, No Place to Hide, and the importance of that importance of having an institution to counterbalance government institutions, have something that provides accountability. So I want to dive into the importance of that and then look at the solutions, because as you were just talking about, we started off with this world of blogs, this kind of decentralized internet. Economies of scale came into place. People needed more viewers for their blogs. You ended up with these centralized platforms, and it all became co-opted. So talking about maybe the decentralization again of that space and some of the solutions out there, and maybe a path forward that you envision could really help the situation. So to start off with, if I would just love you to dive into this idea of the fourth estate and the importance of the media and journalists such as yourself in just upholding integrity, speaking truth to power, something that you've done your entire career.
Sure. I think that in some ways, if we feel like we've discovered some important truth, like had an epiphany about politics or the world, if we go back and start looking backwards in history, we realize that actually we're just rediscovering things that typically have been discovered almost every generation because they're the byproduct of human nature. For me, the radicalizing event for sure in my lifetime was the change in the climate that took place after the attacks of September 11th. I lived and worked in Manhattan. At the time, I was in Manhattan on that day. And, like most people, was somewhat traumatized by those events. It was an enormous deal that 2 passenger jets were flown into, 2 of the most iconic towers in the world, and they collapsed within, 2 hours onto 3,000 people, and another flew into the Pentagon. Obviously, an event that traumatizing is going to change the climate and change the framework, and it did. And I think that people in that moment, and I include myself, and if you look at polls, it's almost everybody, were kind of willing to give some trust and faith into institutions, including the government media institutions, which previously they might have been unwilling to provide. And within a very short period of time, that trust proved to be misplaced when the government and the corporate media united, regardless of motives, to disseminate a series of falsehoods that led to the invasion of Iraq. And very shortly thereafter, people realized that what they were encouraged to be convinced of in order to support this war ended up being false. And that obviously led to a lot of questions about how is it that, not right-wing media, but the most prestigious media, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, NBC News, played such an important and central role in disseminating these incredibly consequential, weighty, but destructive falsehoods. And then that was shortly when I began, right after that, when I began writing about politics based on the idea that the media had obviously failed in its core effort, which is to be an adversarial check against government. And even parts of the media were acknowledging that, saying, we got too close to the government. We became too trusting of it. We didn't do our job to be skeptical of it. But I think that despite paying lip service to that lesson, they didn't actually take steps to separate themselves from those centers of power over which they were supposed to be exercising watchdog scrutiny, but instead were serving as kind of spokespeople for. And we've seen over the years them getting closer and closer. And certainly in the Trump years, as I said earlier, it brought all these institutions closer together than ever. But one of the things that I think that we're now seeing as kind of a backlash against that, I mean, if you look at polls, it's undoubtedly the case that trust and faith in media corporations is at an all-time low. Almost nobody trusts that what they're saying is true. Nobody believes they're reliable any longer. And that is in turn creating a space for a new media ecosystem, one that's independent, one that doesn't rely on these large corporations. And increasingly what you're seeing is the audiences for these large media corporations disappearing and migrating to spaces that have become basically defined by their independence from those orthodoxies. And that to me is the fulfillment of that original promise of the internet I talked about earlier. And it's one of the reasons I'm so devoted to that migration to those platforms that are there to serve as kind of an oasis of free inquiry and free thought. But also because I think that it is vital that we have a check against not just the centers of power, but also these media corporations, which in their own way have become their own center of power as well.
Absolutely. So I just another quick question, then I want to dive into that migration because I think it's super interesting. When you were first publishing all the Snowden revelations, you talked extensively in your book about the rigmarole, all the hoops you had to jump through. The idea that, and I don't think a lot of people realize this, the media is expected to run all of these reports that may be critical of the government past the government in advance and get permission from them in order to post said criticisms of the government. And I was shocked when I learned about that from your book. I did not realize how incestuous this relationship had really become. And I worked in corporate media. I understand that you need to have access, and you need to, in order to keep access, you basically write about, and make films about whatever the White House sends you on a silver platter as news of that day, right? But this was a whole nother level. So I just wanted to get your take on all of that and how we can possibly expect to have a free press if the press is expected to send everything to the White House first to get permission before publishing.
One of the really remarkable and unusual components of the Snowden story was obviously it was the most important national security leak of that year, and I think you could argue of this generation. And in the past, when there was a big national security leak, there were basically only two places that you would go to if you were in the government and had that. One is the New York Times, the other is the Washington Post. That's where Daniel Ellsberg, for example, took the Pentagon Papers. It's where most of the leaks, the big leaks of the war on terror were taken. And, Edward Snowden chose to avoid that framework. He came to me, someone who at the time was a columnist, but only for about 10 months at The Guardian, and had always kind of had one foot at least very much on the outside and just like maybe a few toes within establishment media. And the other was Laura Poitras, who had never worked in any major media outlets, who was a documentarian whose Oscar-winning film in 2005 or Oscar-nominated film in 2005 about the Iraq War got her placed on a watch list, a government watch list. And he has talked about the reason why he came to us. It was because when I first started writing about politics in 2005, the big scandal that I immediately focused on that actually began to build my audience was the New York Times had revealed in December of 2005 that shortly after 9/11, the Bush administration had ordered the NSA to begin spying not on foreign nationals, but on American citizens without the warrants required by American law. They had concocted this theory that the president had the power to ignore congressional law in the name of national security. And it was a huge story. The New York Times published it in December 2005. It won a Pulitzer. And it's what I began my career by writing about almost every day, the significance of that story. As it turned out, the New York Times had learned about this program, not in December of 2005 when they published it, but almost 16 months earlier, in the middle of 2004. And when they learned about the existence of this program, instead of doing their jobs as journalists and going and reporting on it, they instead went to the Bush White House, the top editors of the New York Times, and said, we've learned about this program. And George Bush said, if you publish anything about this, you will have the blood on your hands from the terrorist attacks that you will enable. And the New York Times decided to conceal the existence of this domestic spying program, this illegal domestic spying program, even though in 6 months there was about to be an election, a presidential election, allowed George Bush to stand for re-election without having the American people learn about what the New York Times had known, which is that there was this illegal domestic spying program in place. And the only reason why they even ended up ever publishing it in December of 2005 was because the lead reporter, Jim Risen, had gotten so frustrated and angry knowing that he had this huge story that he told the Times he was going to write a book and publish it there. And the Times was worried that they were going to get scooped by their own reporter. And they finally let him, because they had no other choice, publish it in December of 2005. And the lesson Snowden took from that, and I wrote about it a lot at the time as well, was that even despite this kind of mea culpa that the New York Times and other media outlets did, we weren't sufficiently critical of what we were hearing from the government about Iraq, they still had this interlocking relationship. And what Snowden was most worried about was that he would unravel his life. He would, risk going to prison for decades to turn over this vast archive of secret documents to the New York Times or Washington Post. They would maybe publish one or two documents, win Pulitzers and all the other awards, but get convinced by the US government to hide most of it. And when we got this archive, and I was at The Guardian, That's what the US government very much tried to do, to bully us, to coerce us, to pressure us into concealing essentially all of it. And when I refused, they were shocked because that's not how things worked. And I think that the creation of an alternative way of doing journalism, it's why I left The Guardian to create The Intercept. It's why now I am devoting myself to the development of independent journalism, separate from these big corporations that are wedded in so many ways to the government, to the Pentagon, to the security state, is precisely in recognition of the fact that obviously you can't have a fourth estate if they're actually in bed with the first, second, and third estate, right? They're the mistress of the first, second, and third estate and not the fourth estate. And you need that free press to check those institutions.
Absolutely. So let's dive into this migration that's happening. You just alluded to it yourself. You're now devoted to Substack. It's a fantastic publication. I love how independent it is, because I know that when I'm reading it, I'm reading Glenn Greenwald and I'm not reading something that has been, tempered or has been, dulled down and censored in any way. And that's just so wonderful to get back to those roots of writers being able to connect directly with their audiences. The only hesitation I have about migration to a lot of the popular platforms out there is that we're relying on the goodwill of those CEOs and those central agencies to say, okay, we promise not to censor you. We're actually one of the good ones. I mean, Google started out that way too. Their tagline was, don't be evil. YouTube was, the idea was it's you in your grandmother's basement and with a camera computer doing whatever, and you could connect with an audience. And then they became completely co-opted as well. Now they push all the corporate media narrative. So the only real path, as far as I can see it, is decentralizing the internet, decentralizing these social media platforms. And that seems to be the current wave, the trajectory of the internet. We're moving into Web 3.0. We figured out we now have blockchain technology that allows us to decentralize trust. I personally am on at least 12 different platforms, things like Library, or the front end's called Odyssey, where it's literally based on blockchain technology. That data is on the chain. So the central company who created the front end, they can't censor you. They can't take that data down. It's a new wave of being able to reach people without being controlled. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. Is this a world that you're diving into? I know that currently you're on Substack, but do you have plans to explore some of these censorship-resistant platforms where it's built into the technology?
Yeah, for sure. I think the history there is really interesting and has been a little bit forgotten, which is, if you you said this yourself, and I agree completely, when Google and Facebook and Twitter were first created, the founders of those companies did not intend to be the referees of our political discourse. They weren't looking to censor or define the outer boundaries of permissible speech. Quite the contrary, both for ideological reasons, which is Silicon Valley was kind of dominated by that libertarian mentality that the internet should be free, but also for business self-interested reasons. Why would you create a platform and then start looking for ways to kick people off, right? You'd want as many people as possible to participate. They really didn't want to engage in this role. The reason Facebook and YouTube and Google and Twitter started censoring is because this obligation was foisted upon them largely by large media corporations. The New York Times, NBC News, CNN started essentially turning their megaphone onto these executives and saying, you, Facebook, are allowing people to question the decrees of the CDC and Anthony Fauci and the World Health Organization, or you, Twitter, are allowing people to express right-wing views. And therefore, if something happens, like huge numbers of people don't want to take a vaccine, or people engage in a violent riot at the Capitol, the blood is on your hands. It's because you're being reckless and irresponsible in your refusal to remove harmful content from the internet. And the combination of that harm to their business from that theme emerging, combined with the fact that, even if you're a billionaire, you still live in society and care about what society thinks about you. maybe unless you're Elon Musk, who seems not to, but by and large, most people care, no matter how rich they are, that they not be viewed as evil people. That pressure is very potent. And it was combined with the Democratic Party, once they got control of both houses of Congress and the White House, explicitly telling these companies, if you don't start removing more and more of what we consider hate speech and disinformation, you're going to suffer legal and regulatory reprisals. And these companies kind of got coerced into it. I don't mean to idealize them or exonerate them of blame. I'm just saying that I believe that the forces came first from the outside. And ironically, it's now coming from within their own workforce too. That tends to be this millennial generation that doesn't believe in free speech. So they're getting this pressure from both external and internal sources. When I started to think about how I wanted to go do journalism and where I wanted to go do journalism, once I got censored at my own media outlet, the one that I had created, to give you a sign of how repressive things have become, I felt like blockchain and crypto weren't quite at the point where it would enable me to reach a mass audience, where I was ready to master and understand and promote what that technology was. And so what I looked for was kind of a bridge between traditional, increasingly repressive media and the kind of utopian promise of blockchain that I do think is arriving quickly, but not quite yet here. And that transition for me became companies that were created specifically with the intention to avoid big tech repression. And again, whether because the founders really believe that free speech is virtuous and worth protecting, which I believe is true of the founders of Substack. I'm now at Rumble. I believe they were with a video platform, a competitor to YouTube. I believe they think that too. I just joined Colin, which is a podcast platform founded by David Sachs, one of the early founders of PayPal. I believe all of them are genuinely committed to it, both as an ideology, but also as a business model. Because if they start censoring, essentially, why would you use a platform that is doing the same things as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter? You would just go use Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So for the moment, I trust that they are committed to that. The problem becomes the technological attack. Parler, it's so ironic when I used to object to the censorship of Facebook and Google, what I would hear, ironically, from like people on the liberal left, suddenly sounding like hardcore free market, Keynesians, like free market economists, they would say, well, look, Facebook and Google are private businesses. They can do whatever you want. If you don't like what they're doing, go create your own Facebook and Google. And the idea was, well, actually, they're monopolies. By definition, you can't compete with them. But the people who created Parler heard that challenge. Okay, well, if you don't like Facebook and Google and how much they're censoring, go create your own social media company. Parler did that. And exactly at the moment that they became the most downloaded app, the most popular app in the United States, more popular than Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, the rest, a combination of Apple and Google united to remove Parler from their stores so that you could no longer download it or get updates to it. And then Amazon removed them from web services and basically destroyed Parler overnight. So that was a case where the executives and founders were devoted genuinely to preserving a free speech framework, but they kind of got destroyed by the technological attack. And so the question is, even if you are Substack, Rumble, Colin, or whoever, with a genuine commitment to avoid censoring and capitulating to these social pressures, how do you avoid this centralized dependence that you have on these technologies? A lot of them are thinking very hard about how to create alternatives, but I think you're absolutely right that ultimately the only real solution out of this is to stop using platforms and start using protocols. Like, as you said, things like Ghost and Odyssey and places like that, there is no CEO that you can sufficiently pressure into deplatforming somebody. Right. It just technologically can't be done because of how decentralized blockchain is. So I agree with you that ultimately is where we're going to have to go. Just I'm not quite sure it's pervasive and user-friendly enough yet to be a form of mass media.
Absolutely. So on that note, I wanted to invite someone else into our chat. So really excited to have Willy Woo, who's a leading Bitcoin on-chain analyst and an example of this new type of media creator and publisher, moving away from these traditional platforms. He's built initially a following on Twitter and is now one of the highest grossing Substacks. He has a paid market intelligence newsletter called Bitcoin Forecast and is an author, investor, and technologist and cryptocurrency advocate. So welcome to the show, Willy, and we will continue this discussion, really focusing on what you and Glenn have built out in this alternative media world. So to start off with, I'll throw it to you, Willy. What has your experience been on Substack? And do you feel that it's sufficiently censorship resistant? Where do you think the future is going in terms of this alternative content creation?
Actually, I'm thinking I've really appreciated Substack and the usability is there. It's very quick to get started, very quick for any publisher to get their voice out, earn an income, and really bootstrap. My experience is that ultimately I think that this thing is going to move to platforms. We actually looked at Ghost, but it just wasn't there in terms of features. And I think there's something around the profit incentive for that centralized startup that can really, hone in the experience. It gives them an early advantage. But generally, we've seen this play out. It's very hard to build something that works well in the first generation. So usually you have proprietary platforms that dominate. And you've seen that with iOS, with Apple, and then usually what happens is it's well understood enough, and then you have a lot of people that build on top of that and make it more open. So that's the way I view Substack. It's a very important platform. I think it's strengthening on democracy, but I also think there's more evolutions ahead of it that would really create like open protocols, open standards that truly decentralized and not subject to these kind of political pressures.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, like, when we go to the full decentralized world, maybe towards the crypto side, it's very early. I know it makes a lot of headlines, but in reality, only 3% of the world use or have exposure to Bitcoin and crypto. So if you were to look at that in the adoption terms of the internet, we're really very much in like the mid-90s of the internet, and but it's accelerating very, very quickly. Its adoption curve is way higher than any other technology ever. So we're only like maybe 4 years away. Like the current trend says in the next 4 years, 1/8 of the world population will be on crypto. So, and then it's doubling at the rate of 2x per year. So it's going to come up really fast. And though we're really early and the experience isn't there, I think there's going to be huge strides over the next 4 years. The next decade is going to be very different. And a lot of the conversation has been around nation states and governments abusing power. Now, it's interesting in that, like, crypto is the power of decentralized money. It's money that is by consensus by the general population that has value, and it's created by the population. You did not need to be a sovereign nation state to create that. And if you look at sovereign states, they are really funded by two things. Both of them are taxes. One is the tax on income and corporate income, personal and corporate income, and the other tax is the hidden tax by being able to print more of your money to fund your nation. Now, when you get into the situation where we've created a decentralized money and it's global, and citizens have the option to actually accumulate that rather than the national currency. It really depowers a lot of what we've traditionally seen with the nation state. So I think that in the next 10 years, we've got a lot of changes afoot. It's almost like the completion of the digital revolution, and we don't know what's going to happen after that, but I kind of see a lot of this kind of posturing for control, even between nation states, and maybe China and US is like grabbing the headlines right now. I kind of think that given the arc of technology, this kind of battle is going to be somewhat obsoleted, which is kind of a very it's not the most common viewpoint, but this is what the numbers show with the adoption of crypto.
Absolutely. Well, we are actually out of time for this segment, but Willy, so great for you to join us to talk about your Substack experience. And Glenn, just been wonderful chatting with you about media in general. So I wish both of you all the best as you begin your independent journalist journey and start to explore more decentralized media as well. Excited to see what that future holds. But I do believe we're taking a short break now. And when we come back, we're going to be hearing from Chjango and Derek and diving into Taproot. So stick with us, so we'll be back soon.